Thank you so much. That's a very kind introduction. Truly appreciate it, and the invitation to be here. As was mentioned, I'm Luke, and I'm on faculty at San Diego State. And so obviously when there's an invitation to speak within our own system of the CSU, it's an honor, it's a privilege, and to be able to talk with my colleagues. Before we get going, if I could just have screen sharing ability, I should have asked for that earlier. So my apologies for not doing so yet. But the title of today's talk is Closing Equity Gaps and Creating Opportunities in the Classroom. And my focus will be really on how a lot of these issues really manifest in the lives and experiences of students who may identify as Black and African American. But that being said, you'll see that most of my comments really deal with racial equity, really thinking about students who have been minoritized in education because of their racial ethnic backgrounds, and what we can really do to think about how that affects them, and then also what we can do to simply change that as educators. So this was, my information. I think the introduction covered all about the different titles, but for those of you who may be on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it might be, my handle is all the same, Dr. Luke Wood, and would love to connect with you afterwards and be able to hear, exchange with you in terms of questions or comments that you might have. So definitely looking forward to that. Anytime I have a chance to talk to an audience that's more of a pipeline audience, whether, dealing with, early education, elementary school, middle school, high school, community college, university level education, I always begin with this quote from Asa Hilliard. And many of you may be familiar with his work. He was an Africana studies scholar, an Egyptologist, to be specific, a psychologist, an educator, who really spent his life and career looking at what does it take for students who are Black and African American to be successful in school. And he really kind of came down and really kind of boiled it down to this statement here. He says, I had never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. And we know that love is not always equally distributed to all students in schools based upon their backgrounds and their identities and how they may be perceived by educators who are working with them. But ultimately, that's the kind of thing that we need to bring into the educational space. And when we think about this work, I think about it through the lens of equity. And I know that many of us here, because of the work we do, are likely familiar with equity. And because there's so many different definitions and perceptions of it, I thought I'd start with the definition that myself and my colleague Frank Harris use. And really, it's, if you think about the different images that are out there of people at a baseball field, and there's different sized boxes, or they're under a ladder, under a tree with ladders, and there's different sized ladders. Really what it's trying to connote is that equity refers to us having a heightened focus on groups that experience disproportionate impact in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and outcomes. Notice that we don't say to remediate disparities in students, their families, or their communities, but really in their experiences and outcomes, which is really a function of what we as educators, or those who we're teaching who are going into the classroom, create for those students. Now, there's lots of different students who experience disproportionate impact based upon their identities, African-American students, Latinx students, Native American students, but then we also see, of course, additional student groups, and of course the intersections among all these groups: low income, those who are English language learners, students with disabilities, those who've been justice impacted, who've either been part of the juvenile justice system, have maybe parents who are part of the criminal justice system, but somehow they were justice impacted, and then people like myself who are current or former foster youth. And those are all some of the groups that we focus on within the work that we do. I'd also say that within the equity space, there should also be a heightened focus on Pacific Islanders and those who are Southeast Asian, so Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese. When we think about this work, we really think about it through the lens of equity-mindedness. So it means taking that notion of equity that I just described and having it change the ways in which we think about the work that we do, and those who we're preparing to go into the classrooms, for them to change the ways that they think about the work that they do as well. And according to Estela Ben-Simon, who is a professor at USC who recently retired, who headed up the Center for Urban Education for many years, it really comes down to four things. First, we have to recognize the ways in which systemic inequities serve to disadvantage minoritized people in a range of social institutions and contexts, whether that's criminal injustice system, because oftentimes for people from my community, there's no justice in it. But one of the other things that I think is important to recognize is that inequities in one system can serve to amplify inequities in other systems. So for example, let's say that you have an inequity in employment. You're either unemployed or underemployed. That can have and exacerbate inequities in your healthcare, your access to healthcare or quality healthcare. But one that we're probably even more familiar with is what is referred to as the school to prison pipeline, which suggests that inequities in education serve to amplify inequities in the criminal justice system. The second thing she says is that when we see outcome disparities, we don't look at the school, the students, their families, or their communities. We look at the school, we look at the college, we look at the university, and we rationalize that as an indicator of institutions' underperformance. And then lastly, she talks about us critically reflecting upon our own roles. What are we doing or not doing as educators that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see? If my colleague Frank Harris were here, he would also say that there's really a fifth component that we have to recognize, and that is, in order to really truly be equity-minded, we have to have the action of holding one another accountable. It's very easy for us to see things take place that shouldn't, to know we have colleagues who don't treat our students of color in ways that are respectful to them, to know that we are preparing some educators who are going into the classroom who aren't doing the work that they should be doing. And we have to do what's hard, which is to hold them accountable. And as we think about this, I was in a conversation I was actually at a college in Detroit, and someone talked about the difficulty of doing so. Talked about it being uncomfortable, talked about how it's hard for us to be able to sit and learn all the different students' names. And someone in that audience responded, and it's always been a quote that we've always used since then. It says that, if we don't hold one another accountable, we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. And so we have a responsibility, we have a duty to be able to do so. Now, as we are emerging from the global pandemic of COVID-19 to becoming more of an endemic era where really this is just part of an ongoing part of our daily lives, I think it's important for us to just turn back for a moment and reflect upon what the past 2 years looked like for us as educators, but also for the students that we serve. We know that COVID-19 bore disproportionate infections, unemployment, and loss of life, especially in minoritized communities. For many of us, it meant that we transitioned our classes to teaching online at the drop of a hat. And we learned that students had major issues in accessing technology. We saw that there was significant issues in terms of basic needs, students who experienced food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers. We also saw the racial reckoning that took place in the country after the murder of George Floyd, and the anti-Asian bias, and the murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, that there was this persistent racial stress that was taking place. And it led to, in many ways, communal trauma. Individuals who themselves had loved ones who were lost, individuals who saw those on television losing their lives. And in our community colleges in particular, there was an exodus of students. There was one community college that myself and my colleague, Dr. Harris, were working with, where in that college, they went from 1,500 Black students at the beginning of the pandemic to 500 in the middle of it. That's the significant attrition that they experienced. And now many of us are seeing what is taking place now with what's called the Great Resignation, with our colleagues who are leaving higher education, particularly in areas like student affairs, those who are in the classroom, those who are the front line in engaging students and supporting students during this time, now leaving institutions of education. And so these are real issues that I think it's important for us to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, on your screen is a theoretical model that myself and my colleague, Frank Harris, have put together, talking about what we refer to as Racelighting. And for those of you who may have participated in a previous session that we've done on Racelighting, don't worry, this whole session isn't focused on it, but there's certainly some elements that we want to share that we think are relevant to the work that we're all doing and to the experiences that our students have, whether they're in preschool or doctoral level education. So on the left-hand side of your screen, we can see that we have a culture that is rooted in white supremacy. And when you mix that together with a focus on the nation state and Americana, it becomes white nationalism. When people respond to these issues, oftentimes they do so from a defensive standpoint, which demonstrates fragility. But we also know that anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, homophobia, so many other elements are prevalent within our society. And ultimately, these serve to create bias. And there's different types of bias that I'm sure many of us are all aware of: explicit bias and implicit bias. Now, most institutions love to talk about implicit bias because it's that comfortable one where we can talk about things that aren't going well, but we can do so in a way that leads other people in the room to feel like what is happening is okay. But in reality, explicit bias is also in place too. And it refers to people who have overt and intentional beliefs, like in their minds, they see other individuals from a negative standpoint, they perceive them as being lesser than, and they consciously know that they're doing so. Now, across all the different campuses that we've had a chance to work with, hundreds of campuses across the country, we've seen examples of implicit bias, explicit bias rather. It can be an individual who uses a racial epithet. It can be going into the bathroom and seeing swastikas on the wall. It can be going into a locker room and seeing somebody who thinks it's funny to put a noose around one of the lockers. These are things that happen all the time on campuses across the country. And in fact, in my role as a chief diversity officer and person who works with a lot of different campuses, I've seen these flyers, all of them except one, as part of the work that I've done, being posted around campuses, where campuses regularly are flyered by organizations that essentially try to convey to our students messages of supremacy, messages that see individuals as being lesser than if they don't come from certain communities. And it's really interesting because in USA Today, they had this article that came out recently. And the article said this: it said that hate groups declined in 2021. And I'm sure that when many people saw that, they're like, oh, great, that's amazing. That's positive. That's the right direction. But they also said that fringe ideology is a powerful force that shapes US politics. But then when you started to read further as to what they meant was that the total number of hate groups did decline. But if you look at the bottom, they also said this: the decline does not indicate that the far right's power is waning, but rather suggests that extremist ideas have moved from fringe groups to the political mainstream, meaning that you didn't have to be part of a supremacist group to start to have ideologies, because you could turn on the news, you could turn on the radio, you could turn on any type of thing, any type of device, and be connected to fringe ideologies, which suggested that the very students that I know many of us are fighting for are perceived as being lesser than, and that they don't belong here. Now, there is also implicit bias too, and this is the more subtle type of bias that takes place. And there's two different definitions and one description on your screen. I'm going to give you a moment to I'll read the first one, and then I want you to take a moment as I'm doing so, and I'll pause for a few minutes afterwards. Use that chat window. If there's any words or phrases that pop out to you or stand out to you, I'd love to hear like what helps to, in your mind, convey what implicit bias is. But the first definition comes from the Kerwin Institute, and they say it's the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control. It can be either positive or negative. We can have positive stereotypes that see some students as being more moral, more intelligent, of greater worth, and simultaneously see other students who are viewed as being less moral, less intelligent, and of lesser worth. And it says that everyone is susceptible. It doesn't say that some people are or that most people are, but everyone. That includes me, That includes you all, and that includes others who might watch this in the future. So I'm just pause for a moment, and if you see other words that stand out to you, I'd love for you to share those in that chat window so we can see what words help to convey this in your mind. And given, okay, here we go. Someone says without intentional control. So we're not necessarily aware that we're doing it. And it comes from traces of past experience, someone said, which is referring to what's called the primacy effect, which means that if we've had experiences in our lives where, let's say that we were with a family member early on and we were driving through a neighborhood and they said, this is a bad neighborhood. They said to roll up the window and lock the door. Or you were in the watching the television in your home and you saw searching for Black male suspect, searching for Latino male suspect. These traces of past experience, what happens is as we're engaging with one another, our mind begins to, as we are speaking and moving very quickly, to begin to fill in the blanks with those traces of past experience. And that's why we're conveying bias to one another. Someone says it motivates our actions. And I think that's important because these things don't just stay with us, right? We communicate these things to one another on a daily basis. And one of the ways that we do that is through what are called microaggressions. Now, there are 3 different types of microaggressions that we like to talk about and like to think about. One is called microassault, which is basically when you are conveying explicit bias, right? So it's using a racial epithet, right? It is essentially saying something negative about a person with an intentionality to do so. Micro insults and micro invalidations are the more subtle ways in which this plays out. And so ultimately we communicate these microaggressions and we do so on a daily basis. Now, microaggressions is a term that was actually created by a Black scholar, a psychiatrist actually from Harvard University, Chester Pierce. And what he was trying to do was to convey the ways in which Black people experience indignities in their daily lives, and even in just the most mundane and simplest of ways in which essentially they are treated, and we are treated, since I'm from that community, as being lesser than. Since then, there's been a lot of work done by different scholars. One is Daryl Wing Su, who's really expanded out a framework to help to think about microaggressions. Many of you may be familiar with the works of scholars such as Daniel Solorzano, Miguel Ceja, and others who have really tried to expand the ways in which we think about this. But essentially, you can see from the definition from Su, they're brief and commonplace. They're daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. They're the put downs, the subtle snubs, the dismissive looks. And they're also harder to place because of a concept called attribution ambiguity. I'd love for you to put that word into the chat window. Attribution ambiguity. Now, attribution ambiguity is essentially like haziness or lack of clarity about what just occurred. Now, when I was growing up, I'm from far northern California, from a small town, a wonderful place to grow up called McLeod. But like most places in the country, McLeod was not immune to racism. And so as part of my daily experience, as a regular experience that I would have every single day, I would be called the N-word. I would be called a cottonhead. I'd be called a niglet. I'd be called other racial epithets as part of my daily experience between the time I was in, say, kindergarten to about 5th or 6th grade. But when someone would do that, there was no lack of clarity in my mind about what that was. I knew that was racism. And I knew what box to put that in. I knew in some ways, at least how to think about approaching it. But then as I got older, I started to notice that it was subtle things that someone would say to me that were far more beneath the surface. It was when someone would say to me with a sense of surprise, "Oh, wow, you're so articulate." And I would think at first, is that a compliment? But then I would notice that sense of surprise, which then was communicating something different. And so I started to recognize the more subtle ways in which these messages play out. And that's why psychologists say that microaggressions can be more psychologically damaging than direct acts of racism because of that attribution ambiguity, the lack of clarity about what's taking place and what's going on. Now, with microaggressions, it's not about what's said, it's about what's really said. Now, I'd love for you again to use that chat window to type in, it's what's really said, right? Because what's said is, oh, wow, you're so articulate. But what's really said is, I didn't think that you would be. What's said is, can I see your ID to a student who's on campus at nighttime? But what's really said is, I think you're here to steal something. What's said is to a student, oh, you come from someone might say, oh, those people, they come from a bad community, right? And what's said is that you're lesser than, you're not of worth, you don't belong here, right? So these microaggressions, it's not just what's said, it's what's really said. And what's really said is what's on your screen. Is you don't belong here. You're different from us. You're not intelligent. You're not capable. You're lazy. You don't care. You're dangerous. You're criminal. You're deviant. You're up to no good. You're not a person who's of worth. What's really said are these messages that are devastating to our students beginning in the earliest levels of education. There's lots of different types of microaggressions, and this isn't a topic, this isn't a speech on microaggressions, right? Just talking about this as part of the experiences that our students have. But there's three that I'd really like to point out as we think about that. The first is an ascription of intelligence. The second is an assumption of criminality. And a third is pathologizing culture. An ascription of intelligence is when we say to a student, or we assume that a student is less intelligent because of their race. And we see this all the time with our students, where our students are assumed to not have the capability of being able to do the work. Some examples on your screen. The teacher called me a week after I submitted my paper. She said, I read your paper. Wow, you wrote this? They were shocked that I could write. Or this one happened during COVID, where students said, in my Zoom breakout room, I answered a question, and then one of the boys said, wow, you're smart for a Black girl, right? These notions of inferior intelligence that play out in all different types of ways. These are examples in college, but you'll see some examples in early childhood in a short moment. Assumptions of criminality. When we assume that students are dangerous, deviant, up to no good, criminal, have some sort of malintent. Here's an example that a student told us. He said, I wrote the teacher to let him know that I wasn't able to attend class because my internet was down. This was during COVID. The teacher wrote back very angrily, insinuating that I was lying. And the student exclaimed, like, lots of people are having internet problems right now. Why is the faculty member focused on me? Or this example here, I was in a virtual breakout room with my teacher, and he said, Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their papers than others. It's not that they're not smart, it's just that they don't understand the language, right? These assumptions that people are going to cut corners. And we see this not just in doctoral level education, not in just a master's program, not just in undergraduate education, but in the earliest levels of schooling. I've been part of a project called Our Voices, where we've collected over 1,000 narratives from parents of Black children. It's a racial counter storytelling approach, where we essentially have them write narratives talking about what are their children's experiences in preschool through third grade, in the earliest levels of schooling, preschool through third grade. Here's some examples of what we see. We see a few patterns that are on the right-hand side of your screen. First, students are assumed to be troublemakers. They're assumed, even at that earliest levels of schooling, to be up to no good. You can see with the quote on the top-hand side, I seen the assistant teacher going into a verbal battle with my son as my son was trying to explain the situation. The teacher said, well, the other kid said you started it, and took his word for it without even trying to hear my son. These are examples of what we see even at the earliest levels of schooling. But we also know that children can be labeled with terms: bad, physical, hyper, aggressive, defiant, deregulated, misbehaving, a bad kid. And think about how those messages early on serve to label students and then inform both their parents and them and the other children in the classroom what they are to think about them. We see this happen very often in our work. And in fact, there's never been a narrative that we've collected where we didn't hear examples when we do interviews, especially of their children being labeled. I'll just read one example. It's the second one down. The teacher repeatedly described my 7-year-old child as aggressive because he put his all into winning at sports and games. The parent said, I had to interject numerous times, reminding the teacher that my child is competitive, not aggressive. The parent had to reframe. We also know that because they're assumed to be troublemakers and they're labeled with these terms, they're more likely to be hyper-surveilled for wrongdoing. What that means is that teachers' attentional focus, their attentional gaze, is more closely situated on students. They spend more time watching them for wrongdoing. One parent said, I would also witness them constantly watching my son. When I brought it up, they denied it. I explained that of course they would see him doing more things if they were always watching him. I witnessed other children doing the same things and no one would even engage them. He was the only Black kid in the school, the earliest levels of education. But in addition to that, we know that children are oftentimes singled out for punishment. Black, Latinx, and Native children in particular. Let's say that you have 4 boys and they're in kindergarten. And let's say that one of them is Native American and 3 of them are white, and they're on the playground and they're throwing rocks against the fence. Now, should they be throwing rocks against the fence? No. But is that age-appropriate behavior for a kid in kindergarten? Yes. It's an opportunity to correct. It's an opportunity to provide some guidance and to tell children to do something different. But that's not what we see that happens. That one Native child will be pulled out and yelled at and removed from recess while nothing happens to the other children. They're singled out for punishment. We also see the same thing in Black communities. I'll read the third one down. This is from a parent of a Black child in early childhood. He said, an incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed out a rainbow and about 3 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. Now he can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out, when 4 other kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair. They're also subject to harsher punishments. One child is removed from recess. Another child has nothing happen to them. One child is suspended. Another child maybe loses recess. One child is suspended for multiple days. Another child is suspended for 1 day. So we always see that the punishment is harsher, is more prolonged, and that sends a message. And what's interesting about it is that they're oftentimes used, particularly Black boys and Native boys, as an example of what not to be, how not to act, how not to learn. You have children in a classroom, and you've got a kid who's in 1st grade and he's tapping his pencil, right? Now, other kids are tapping their pencils, but he's the one that gets yelled at as an example of what not to be. Then the teacher says, everyone line up, we're going out for recess. And they line out. Now, lots of kids are out of line, but she picks on that same kid and says, hey, so-and-so out of line, get back in line, as a way of communicating to other children, again, what not to be, how not to act, how not to learn. And these are devastating messages that happen all the time. Children can also be viewed through a disorder-based lens, assumed to have ADHD, assumed to have be emotionally, behaviorally disturbed. For those of you in special education, we know that there is a significant overrepresentation of Black children, Black boys and Native boys in particular in special education in our state. It's a common pattern that we see. And then lastly, we also know that their culture can be pathologized. And I like to think about this as the they statements. They're lazy. They don't care. They're not really here for school. They come from bad communities. Their parents don't care. They're only here for the financial aid. These are things that we hear at all levels of education. Now, during COVID, we collected data from about 500 parents of Black children who had children in early childhood, asking them and providing them with these common examples of microaggressions that we see. And during COVID, we saw that the top 3 examples that we saw that parents of Black children reported was being surprised when their child would succeed academically. Just remember this, that we have to have high expectations for our students. No one has ever risen to low expectations. Secondly, they were immediately disciplined for perceived wrongdoing. Even when there was an opportunity to try to learn something about what actually happened, it was perceived that they did wrong. They were immediately disciplined without there being an opportunity to learn what occurred. And then they were singled out for punishment, even when other children did the same thing. We also know that this can differ by the background of the teacher. All teachers engage in these issues. No, you can't say that, hey, Black children are going to be immune from this if they're taught by Black teachers. They may be less prone to doing so, but they're not totally immune. We do see differences even based upon the gender of the child. In this case, you can see that when we ask parents about teachers who assume that their children were troublemakers, when the child was a Black female taught by a white teacher, 21% of them said that that was true. 42% said that was true when they were Black males, Black boys. During COVID, we also collected narratives from parents, and the number one theme that we had during the pandemic, well, let me back up. The number one theme that we had prior to the pandemic was being singled out for punishment. The number one theme that we had during the pandemic was being ignored in the classroom. Here's some examples of what that looked like. Here's some examples of what we saw. At the beginning of the school year, I was watching her and witnessed the teacher, who's white, calling every other student but her. She's the only Black student in the class. The teacher also ignored what she said. When I know she was unmuted because I watched her turn on her microphone. He has sided her answers, and when she's asked for help multiple times, he just ignores her or addresses the whole class. Another parent said, he's the only Black student in the class. I have noticed that his teacher was very abrupt and not patient with him. She didn't even give him a moment to unmute himself in the Zoom class to respond to her. We did see examples of students being singled out for punishment. It was not as extreme as we saw prior to the pandemic, but certainly was taking place. We saw children being put into Zoom breakout rooms and left there for long periods of time. What I would call a de facto in-school suspension, but ways in which those data were never documented. Now, we've written a lot about suspensions, and I know that my colleague Molly Springer is on this as well. We've also done some work together looking at what this looks like for Native American children as well. We have a report out called From Boarding Schools to Suspension Boards, looking at data in terms of exclusionary discipline. And I would say that in general, across all the reports that we've ever done, what we find is this, is that when we're talking about the highest suspension rates in the state, therefore African-American boys followed very closely by Native American boys. And when we're talking about the highest expulsion rates in the state, therefore Native American boys followed very closely by Black boys. And so it flips, but it's the two groups. And that's why there's so much focus, I believe, on BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. But I'd also say that when we start looking at the Latinx populations and different intersections of those who are English language learners, of those who may be children with disabilities or come from lower income backgrounds, we also see egregiously high suspension rates as well. And that's why we did this report focused on Black children pretty recently called Suspending Our Future. This is looking at statewide data from the California Department of Education. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see the orange bar, that's 9.1%. That's an unduplicated suspension rate. That means that 9.1% of Black children are suspended in a given year. That is not a multiple suspension rate, so that doesn't account for just a child who's suspended multiple times. That doesn't account for a child who's suspended in first grade, second grade, third grade. That's just at least one time in one given year. But we do know that multiple suspensions occur as well. And that's actually how I personally got into this research, because I am, as I mentioned earlier, a former foster child, and I was part of a transracial adoption, and my parents, who I grew up with, are white and very loving, very caring. But I also went to an all-white school where me and my brother were the only Black students. And by the time I hit 5th grade, I had a teacher who didn't perceive me as being someone who contributed to the classroom environment, didn't see me as a person who was of worth, who saw me as nothing more than a problem. And when I was in 5th grade, my twin brother was suspended 24 times, and I was suspended 42 times in 1 year by the same teacher. And every previous year, I'd never been suspended, and I was always one of the highest performing students in the classroom. I went from loving school to hating school in 1 year, to seeing it as a place that I didn't belong, as a place that wasn't for me. And if it wasn't for one of the most amazing teachers that I've ever met that following year, Mr. G, who I'm still in touch with to this day, I don't know where I would be. But as you can look in the middle of your screen, you'll see that we have the overrepresentation of boys of color. You'll see that it's 11.8% suspension rate for Black boys, followed by 10.1% suspension rate for Native American boys. When we start to look at these data for San Bernardino County, you can see that the statewide patterns pretty much bear out the same. For African American boys, they have the highest suspension rate at 10.9, African American children rather, it's 10.9% suspension rate. This data is from 2018-19 because you can't look at the last 2 years of data. They're not very useful because of COVID-19, because the data simply weren't collected in the ways that would be helpful. But if you look at the proportionality in terms of overexposure, the overexposure patterns are the same. If you look at this data for Black boys, it actually jumps up to 14%, above 14% for San Bernardino County. And you have many schools in the county that has suspension rates of 30 and 40% for Black boys. When we look across grade level, across the state, we see that the highest suspension rates are in middle school, followed by high school. But when we start to look at disparities between, say, Black boys and the overall average, we find that the highest suspension rates are not in high school, they're not in middle school, and they're not even in latter elementary. They're actually in early childhood education, where they're 522% more likely to be suspended than their peers. The most egregious patterns of disparity occur in the most important levels of education, where children are learning, growing, and developing, where they're making decisions about their place in school, where they're determining whether this is a place that I want to be, whether this is a place that's safe, whether this is a place that's welcoming, whether this is a place where I belong. And that's what ultimately happens, is that these issues don't just lead to the microaggressions and suspensions, they lead to psychological harm, a lack of safety for our children at all levels of education. One of the things that we know happens is what's called Racelighting. And many of you may say, well, what's Racelighting? I know that some of you may have seen, because we did a presentation recently for the California Faculty Association, may have seen some conversation on that. But let me just say this, that you probably already know what it is. Racelighting is what happens when gaslighting is racial. So think about what happens with gaslighting. There's a brief that we've done on it. In case anybody is interested in learning more, you can go to the bmmcoalition.com/racelighting. But it comes from, the term racelighting comes from gaslighting. So we have to kind of back up and say, well, what is gaslighting? Well, it comes from the 1938 play Gaslight by Patrick Hamilton. And in the play, there are two main characters, Jack and Bella. Jack and Bella. And Jack is the villain in the play, and Bella is the victim. And they're married, and they move to an affluent neighborhood. And Jack is intent upon making Bella feel as if she's losing her mind. So what does he do? There's pictures and paintings on the wall. He takes them down, he hides them, and then he accuses Bella of stealing them. And whenever she asserts her innocence, he says, you know how you imagine things, or see, you're lying again. See, you're not being truthful. He does the same thing, goes to the kitchen and takes away knives and forks and spoons and accuses Bella of stealing them. And she asserts her innocence. And with such conviction, he tries to convince her that she is indeed the one who's done so. But there's a different part of the house that Bella doesn't even know about. And Jack is in there, he's banging around, he's looking for jewels. And when he does so, he turns on a light. And the light in the house was lit by gas. And so if you had light on in the existing part of the house, and then you lit a new light in a different part of the house, there was less light to go around, less gas. And so the lights began to dim. The lights began to flicker. And she would see this with her eyes. She would see a visible change in her environment. And she would bring it to Jack. And he would again say, you know how you imagine these things. And so we believe that there's two different types of race lighting. Race lighting when someone does something and it's very apparent what just occurred, and you bring it to their attention and they try to make you feel as if it's you. You see someone who's used a racial epithet and you bring it to their attention and they say, that's not what I said. And they assert their innocence with such conviction that you begin to think, maybe I misunderstood that. But even more commonly, it can be through an accumulation of microaggressions in an environment where students are told that they're academically inferior. They're told that they're dangerous, deviant, up to no good. They're told that they come from communities that are lesser than. And these microaggressions begin to swell up in that environment in a ways that makes them begin to question themselves. And so we define race lighting as the process whereby people of color begin to question their own thoughts and actions due to systematically delivered racialized messages that make them second guess their own lived experiences and realities with racism. And this affects our students, but it can also affect us as educators too. It can happen with exchanges with our colleagues. And so I would say to you who are here, if you ever get to that point where you begin to say, well, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I don't belong here. It could be that doubt, that disorientation that's race lighting. It can be through an accumulation of microaggressions in the environment that make us second guess our experiences, our feelings, our capabilities, our knowledge, our decision-making, and even our basic humanity. This happens to us, but can also happen to the students that we serve. And it can also happen to the students that our students serve. And so there can be signs very similar to gaslighting where you begin to second guess yourself. You feel disoriented and hazy, that attribution ambiguity, a general sense of unease and anxiety, where you feel like you're under fire, like every single mistake that I made is made into a larger deal. And so now you're second guessing yourself and you're concerned that you can't get things right. Maybe I'm really not as good as I thought I was as a scholar. Maybe I'm not really doing what I should be doing. And you start to avoid others and maybe even have a sense of hopelessness. But all this matters even more, not even because of race lighting, but because what the outgrowth of that can be. Imposter syndrome, stereotype threat, but it can also be racial battle fatigue. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, it's created by a scholar called William Smith from the University of Utah. And he's created a framework to help us make sense of the mundane, everyday racism that plays out in our society, but how it affects us. And he says it affects us really in three ways: cognitively, how we process and retain information, emotionally, in terms of our psychology, and physiologically as well. And so ultimately, he calls it racial battle fatigue because what he has found, which is profound, is that the effects of racism, when you're in an environment of persistent racial stress and strain, actually mirror combat stress syndrome in terms of how people respond to being in prolonged environments of risk. And there can be symptoms that are physiological, physical. Tension headaches, backache, elevated heartbeat, an upset stomach, and inability to sleep. I see this in our work that we do in early childhood as well. You have a child who's in kindergarten. They don't know how to say to their parents, my teacher is microaggressing me. Can you intervene? They don't know how to say to their parents, I don't feel a sense of belonging in school. But they say in the morning to their parent, I don't want to go to school. And the parent says, why? Why do you keep saying this? And they say, because my stomach hurts. Because their body is having a physiological, a physical response to an environment that is unsafe and unwell. But it can also be psychological too. Anxiety and worrying, loss of confidence, emotional and social withdrawal, anger and anger suppression. And so ultimately these things matter because we have to create different environments for our students. So what I'd like to do now is to conclude my remarks by recommending some things that I think we should do. And I provide these recommendations at the end, like most scholars would do, but because without the context as to why they matter, they may not make sense as to why they're important for us to implement in our classrooms. And these recommendations span different levels of education. The first is, if you have colleagues, you have students, right? Or even in training your students, tell them to believe what people say. If they say that I've experienced something, our initial response shouldn't be disbelief. It should be believing. And let me tell you where that comes from.
Jason?
Wow. I hope we can get it back.
Yeah. Jason, please.
What happened?
The guy, the presenter just froze and got some. Jason, please. Oh. Just
He's not there.
yeah, freeze up and he got disconnected from his side.
It says he's still there.
Huh?
It says he's still there.
Where is he?
I think you just.
Jason Bullock? No, we're not talking
Send him
Jason.
something in the chat.
Oh, which Jason are you talking about?
No, we're talking of the presenter, Dr. Wood.
Oh, he's gone?
Yeah, he's just disappeared. Okay.
Oh, he was in as Hillel. Oh. No, he was in
Okay,
as-
so I'm not exactly sure what happened there,
Oh,
Good.
but that was super anticlimactic.
Okay. It's okay. Don't worry.
So I'll just say that the example I was going to give in terms of believing what students say was that, and we've seen this a lot, where you have a young Latino child who's been pushed in the classroom, and he goes and he tells the teacher, right? Instead of pushing back and instead of doing something that he shouldn't have done, he goes and he handles it the way that we've been asking him to handle it. And then the teacher's response is to say, well, what did you do to cause it to occur? And so we think it's important to believe what people say when they say it. We also believe that if it's important for student success, you make it mandatory. So if you know, for example, the only students who are going to pass out of your class or succeed are those who use tutoring or come to your office hours, we think it's important to make that mandatory, because what happens is when we make those things optional for students who may be experiencing lots of external pressures or food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers, they're making very tough decisions about what they can invest their time in. And if we're communicating that it's optional, they can sometimes believe that that means that we're communicating that it's not as important to do. We also believe in proactively reaching out to students who are in need. After the murder of George Floyd, one of the things that we did is we had our Black Resource Center organize this, where we had faculty and staff call every single Black student on campus. Say, how are you doing? Do you need anything? Are you okay? And in that, we heard stories of pain. We heard people who had lost loved ones, unemployment, and we began connecting students to counseling services. We began connecting students to career services. And then we started saying, well, this is a really important practice. So now what we do is every week, all of our first and second year students of color, they get either a phone call or a text message from us, and it rotates, checking in on them and then triaging them to different services. And then we take that information and we share it with senior leadership on campus so that they have a weekly pulse of what's going on campus. It's actually a very low cost strategy that works incredibly well. We also believe in building the Underground Railroad. So when those who were enslaved in the South were escaping to the North, right, you couldn't just stop at any house along the way, right? You had to go to the places and spaces and people who you knew would shield you and protect you. And so I think we have to be honest that most of our institutions are not equity-minded institutions. They're trying to be. And so until that happens, you can't just say, go to financial aid or go to career services or go to tutoring. It has to be the person in that area that you know will care about them and their success in the same ways that you will. And if you do say, just go there, oftentimes they can have a bad experience and it can reflect on you in some ways. So in student services and student affairs, we oftentimes call this a warm handoff, right? Where I'm gonna walk you over to financial aid to introduce you to the person that I know, or whatever service it might be on campus, or the department staff member, right? And it's called a warm handoff because it's from one warm person who cares about you and your success to another warm person who does the same. And we just believe that you can't do a warm handoff to a cold person. So it has to be to someone who you know will care about them and their success. Lastly, or I'll just do two ones and then we'll go to any questions you might have. No statements of support without action. We had some of our student leaders release a statement talking about their support for our Native American community on campus, following some incidents that occurred that really, really just demonstrated some anti-Native perspectives. And there was a statement that came, but then there was no action. And I was doing a presentation a couple of weeks ago in Sacramento, and one of the Native students who attends our school came up to me and they said, you know, I felt like that statement was an example of Racelighting, because it was like saying, we stand with you, we're here to support you, we have your back, but then nothing else came. And the student told me that he would have rather they had not released a statement than to have sent a false promise that help was on the way when there was no intention of doing so. And then lastly, and maybe just to stir the pot a little bit, we also don't believe in validation of effort alone. We think the growth mindset is an incomplete theory in that it tells us to focus on students' effort, their resilience, their grit, the multiple drafts of papers they do, the focus on that in terms of how we encourage them and how we validate them. But we also know that for many students of color, they've never heard the message that you're intelligent, that you have the ability, that you can do it. And so from
It froze again.
Oh, sorry, please hang in there. And I think he will soon join us. Okay. Okay. Please, if you have questions, maybe we can put our questions in the chat box now. And if and when he comes back, then we can direct him there. And okay, he's back now.
I guess it's funny that I gave the example of a student having internet problems and then I end up having internet problems.
A real life experience example. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe next time I'll come in person.
Yes.
We would love to.
Yes. Oh,
So you were going to say you stated the last item on your screen. You were going to provide us the last words on that.
Validation.
Oh,
Validation.
validation. Yeah. So in terms of validation, we don't really ascribe to growth mindset in the work that we do, in that we think that it is a very good theory, but it's incomplete, in that in traditional growth mindset, you focus on validation of students' effort, their multiple drafts of paper, their grit, their resilience, their hardiness, and you're specifically directed not to validate ability. But we know that for many of our students of color, they've never been given messages that have told them that they're intelligent, that they're capable, that they have the ability to be able to do the work. And so we think that it has to be a combination of both. It's not an either or, it's an and both situation, that really a full range of validation includes validation of effort and validation of ability. In fact, there was an interview I did this week that was part of US News and World Report that talked about this. And I'll share that link in the chat window in case anybody's interested in taking a look.
Yes, please. We'll be fine. Thank you.
okay. Okay. Dr. Wood, are you done?
Yes, I'm done. I was wondering if there's questions, comments,
Okay.
trepidations.
Okay. Please, before we go to questions, please let's thank Dr. Wood for this thought-provoking presentation. And most of us will argue, will agree that this is an issue that we have been thinking about for many years now, trying to do something about it. I'm so grateful that Dr. Wood has done a lot of work for us in this area. Please, let's clap for Dr. Wood for his, again, thought-provoking, powerful presentation. Please, the next now is your questions. Just unmute yourself and then ask your questions. And if you don't want to, or comments, and if you don't want to ask, you can put your questions or comments in the chat room, then I will read out. So let me see, please raise up your hand or use the link to raise up your hand so that I can call you. But the thing, I may not see everybody. Any questions? Okay, if there is no question, I will start. My question would be, for me, that by and large, I'm a foreigner here, and I have a son in a high school, in an elementary school. Most of these things you said, I've been told to my son. For instance, when I come to confront the teacher, he called my wife your baby mama, which I know is a pejorative way of referring to African American kids as not having a father and mother in the home. She told me, my student, I don't have time for hyperactive or HDD student. When my son was never diagnosed with any deficiency, he behaved just like normal kid. From my own pain of experiencing my son go through this, please, any recommendation for those Latinos, Asians that are new, for African American, because they've been here for a long time, they understand, to a large extent, understand these things. But for us that are new, I've been here only maybe 25, 26 years, I'm still learning. Any recommendation, please?
Yeah, I think the first recommendation, and possibly the most important, is actually advice that was given to me by a colleague here who's on faculty. And it was dealing with my own child, she was in preschool at the time, and it was a preschool that we were really excited to get her into. And she was in an environment that wasn't very welcoming. And so we were trying to figure out what to do. And his advice to me was never leave your child in an unhealthy environment, even for the sake of a good school. And when we start to look at suspension rates across the state, one of the things that we know is that it can be a school that has like a score of 7, 8, 9, 10 on greatschools.org. But just because it's a good school for all children in general doesn't mean it's a good school for Black children. And what we find is that some of those schools are the most egregious in terms of how they treat
the students.
I guess that would be one piece of advice. I think another piece of advice would be never assume that the challenges that your child faces are isolated. They're more likely happening to other children as well. We do a yearly program here in San Diego that we've done for 4 or 5 years now called Black Minds Matter. We do it in combination with the County Office of Education, and we bring in parents of Black children of all different types of backgrounds. So San Diego has lots of different Black communities. We have the military Black community. We have transplants like myself from other areas. We have those who are from Southeast San Diego who are, multiple generations in town. And then we have a very large East African population as well. And these communities really don't speak to one another in a kind of more common way. And nothing is more powerful than bringing parents in the room who thought it was just them, thought it was just their child. But then when you start to hear the stories across groups, you realize that we all may come from different backgrounds, but the commonalities are startling. And so that's one thing that I would also recommend.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, others with your questions or comments.
Can you talk about like equitable grading practices in the classroom?
Absolutely. So there's lots of ways to approach grading. From our perspective, it's about learning and should not be done in a way that's punitive. I have lots of conversations with my colleagues, particularly in sciences, who still think that the bell curve is the way to grade and that that's a way of demonstrating rigor. We have conversations, especially when you start talking about equity, you'll notice that 3 words start to pop up a lot: standards, rigor, and excellence. When you're not talking about equity, those words pop up, but not as frequently, but immediately as soon as you start talking about equity, they become the most common words that you start hearing. But what I've tried to do is to challenge people to think differently. We talk about the rigor of what we're doing, right? So that how, in terms of the challenge that we're giving to the students, have we thought about it in the context of rigor for ourselves, how much we're challenging ourselves to improve? We talk about standards of students reaching minimum expectations for what we would want to in terms of a performance. How often do we have those same conversations with our colleagues about standards? If you have 80% of your students of color who aren't doing well, that's not a mark of excellence on your part. That's a mark of a lack of excellence on your part. And so I think that we have to take that language that maybe our colleagues will use and to help them start to think about it in a different way. Standards, rigor, and excellence applies to our students, but it also applies to us. So people use different strategies like contract grading. I'm a fan of that. We believe in using multiple approaches for assessment. So if there can be multiple ways of trying to understand whether a student has actually retained information, that's important. I would also say that in general, if you have a class where, and this doesn't happen as frequently in education, but you see it very often in science and engineering, where they'll basically have a midterm and a final, and that's it. That's how they determine the grade. That is not effective teaching and learning at all. And here's one of the reasons why. If you're going to use an early intervention approach in your classroom, research generally says it should be at 18% of course progress. So if you're not doing it until halfway through the semester, you don't have an early alert system, you have an early drop system, because that's all a student can really do at that point in time. So I believe in continuous feedback and scaffolding. I also believe in allowing students to do multiple drafts of whatever they're submitting and providing them an opportunity to continue to improve. I think we have to start thinking about things from a standpoint of learning, our students really learning the information that we want, rather than the kind of traditional standpoint, which usually doesn't fare well for our students of color. But part of this is because if we think about it, many of us have been trained how to teach, right? And not all of us even, right? But many of us have been trained how to teach. If we go outside of a college education, that's not the case, right? Let's just say your average professor in biology has a bachelor's degree in biology, master's degrees, worked in industry for several years, and has a PhD. What happens? They go right into the classroom with no training on how to teach. So what do? They think of, oh, well, this is what I saw someone else do. This is what I also saw someone else do. And they try to mirror what they saw. But what they do is they teach how they were taught. And how they were taught is typically not how our students of color learn. It's Eurocentric. It's not collectivistic. It is really extending a teaching and learning practice that, in my mind, does harm to our students.
Please, other questions, other comments, please.
Yes, I have a question and a comment. Well, thank you, Dr. Wood, and thank you everyone who helped to organize this event. I truly benefited from it, and I see myself reflected in a lot of the statistics that you've mentioned. As an Arab Latina going to the school here in the United States, as an immigrant, I can resonate. So my lived experiences resonate a lot with the statistics. So one of the questions that I have for you is, when obtaining the data for the research, right, on different populations, how did you obtain it? What were some of the resources or databases, or perhaps, I know the common, but how did you approach that in general? And number two, there's an issue in data collection where, for example, the state of California has the largest population of Arab Americans in the nation. And despite us having that population rate here in California and in the United States, Arabs are not represented, or Arabs or Middle Eastern students are not represented as part of the data. And this is a practice that goes back to the US Census, where we are considered to be white so we're lumped with the white group, right? And so we know from community groups that Arab students, Middle Eastern students face a lot of bullying in school, starting in elementary schools. And so if we do not have the data that appropriately describes our community, how are we able to affect change? And so where do we start to make sure that we are represented in how we are, counted at our schools? Thank you.
Great question. So in terms of the suspension data, those are all publicly available data that come through the California Department of Education. They're incredibly imperfect in the racial ethnic categories, but they're also imperfect in the actual percentages themselves, in that it is very common, particularly in early learning, for ghost suspensions to occur, or hidden suspensions. There's lots of different names for them, but essentially you have a child in kindergarten and they get a call home to their parent on a Friday that says, hey, so-and-so's having problems in the classroom today. Do you want to come pick them up early? And then maybe bring them back on Tuesday instead, right? That's a suspension, but it's never documented as such. The same thing happens with expulsions too, where a child is, well, we don't want something to go on their record. And so are you sure you wouldn't want to take them to another school, right? And so lots of the data itself is imperfect. So on that lens, in terms of the kind of SWANA lens, I know for us, in terms of how we're trying to approach it at San Diego State, is we have a SWANA task force that's in my division that we started maybe 6 months ago. And what we're doing is we're basically trying to change the way in which the campus collects data that comes internally, So what we get from the CSU application doesn't really help us. And so we have to basically collect it internally. Our student leaders have been really good about doing surveys of SWANA students themselves and have been essentially advocating in that way. And it was actually their data that allowed us to be able to get the task force rolling. And so that's one thing that I would encourage is that at this point, I think every campus probably should have a task force that is SWANA focused in order to be able to address those issues, especially in places like San Bernardino, but also places like San Diego, where we have a very large population of students that are oftentimes hidden within that data. And it's interesting that you say that, because there was a district, I think it was Grossmont, but I don't want to be certain about it, that when we were looking at their data for white students, they had this really high suspension rates. And we're like, what's going on here? This is interesting. We haven't seen this before. And then when we looked further, it was essentially SWANA students that were being suspended, but it was being captured under white. And so therefore it would look like the school's average for white students was higher, which then made it so that when we were trying to raise issues around other groups, it wasn't being viewed as a big deal. It's like, oh, well, everybody is, but it actually wasn't true. When you started to look at what it was and disaggregated, you started to see that the patterns themselves were very specific to certain communities.
Yep. Questions, comments?
I have a comment. First of all, Dr. Wood, it's wonderful to see you. I'm so glad I was able to catch the event today. Thanks for allowing me to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the AVP over here in Student Services in Student Affairs under Dr. Oliveras, and my name is Dr. Molly Springer. Luke,
Molly Springer is a rock star. You all
oh, no, thank you. But here's the thing that's come up, right? My kid goes to Redlands High School. I'll just call them out right now. And they're on an IEP, so I was able to kind of get around this with a lot of advocacy. But all the teachers have a rule on the books created by their principal that they need to dock students 50% off for turning in an assignment late. To which, of course, my advocacy for my child was like, what are you, what? What are we teaching? Are we teaching them to learn, or are we just teaching them to clock in on time? Because that's what it feels like, right? That's just an egregious amount of points off for a late assignment. And we're talking about students who are getting 7 to 8 assignments a night. You know, it's really arduous, actually. If there was a better way for me to actually get my kid through high school, I would. In terms of like leaving the school, like when my kid's like a sophomore or junior, they're already embedded into their social group. So we've already done that once. So that's just not going to happen. You know, what is your advice to me as a parent or to others who are needing to hold the schools accountable, but can't necessarily leave the school for whatever reason?
So and I'm going to plug this in, so just a quick second. So I would say that the advice would really be to bring parents together to be able to address the issues. When one parent brings something forward, it can be very easy, particularly if they're from a minoritized community, to be framed as being aggressive or confrontational. And so it makes it so that oftentimes when we raise these issues, that is how they were responded to. So there was a school that we were working with in San Diego. And we began working with this school after there was 2 incidents that had occurred where in kindergarten and back to back in the same classroom, same teacher, children were essentially peeing their pants because they weren't being allowed to use the restroom. Then that's not even the most egregious thing that the teacher was doing. There was lots of other examples that were happening at the time. There was a new teacher who came into a classroom, and within 2 weeks of being there, halfway through the school year, put all 5 Black children at one desk in the back of the class and recommended them all for special education within 2 weeks of being in the classroom, right? So there was this litany of major issues that were happening. And so what we did is we pulled together parents and formed a group called Parents of Black Children. And we met with the principal. And what we did was this, is we asked the principal and vice principal to come into the room and just to listen. We said, we don't want you to say anything. We don't want the school speak. We don't want the preambles. Just listen. And we had each parent go around the room and share their story about what was happening with their child and things that had happened to them. And it wasn't a dry eye in the room, even from the principal and the vice principal afterwards, because it was so egregious and there was so much that was taking place. And again, going back to that point, oftentimes we think it's us, it's oftentimes ends up being that there's way more individuals who are experiencing the same thing. And then what we did is we told the principal, we're not going away, because I'm an administrator. I know how this works, right? If there's a perception that someone is going away, oftentimes there's just less investment in the issue, right? Because you have other issues that seem more pertinent because people are bringing them up. And so we're like, hey, we're not going away. So we came back the next month, and then the next month after that, and next month after that, and next month after that. And we made it clear, we're gonna be back next month. And next time we come, this is what we wanna know. And we had questions every single time. And we asked them at first to collect data on referrals. And they said, no, we can't do that. It's protected information. And I'm a professor of education. So I said, okay, don't want to call BS right now, but I know that's not true. Yes, you can't tell us the children's names, but you can show us the percentages. That's not accurate, right? And so about the 3rd month in, they started doing it and they showed us the data. And they were surprised at how bad it was. It was like, at the school, it was like 16% of the kids were Black, and like they represented like 68% of the referrals. It was egregious. And it was at that point that the principal committed to doing something different. And I have to give them credit. When we started working with that school, they were, for Black children, on every single marker, orange and red, based upon the school color coding system. Suspensions, absenteeism, everything, right? Performance levels. And 2 years later, with this notion that we weren't going away, they were in blue and green across every indicator. I've never seen such a marked turnaround with a school, but it was because there was a principal who was dedicated to basically making a change. And one of the things I remember saying to that principal, because he's Latino, and I said, maybe I shouldn't have said it, but it was true. I said, we expect more from you because you're a person of color too. Mm-hmm. And you know what? He responded in the most positive way. He says, you know what, you're right. And they brought in restorative practices into the school. They did trainings on anti-Blackness, on microaggressions, on bullying. I mean, they like really, truly went all in. And it was like, again, one of the biggest turnarounds that I've ever seen with a school. So I believe you bring the parents together, because in numbers, it's much harder to basically say, oh, that's just your kid, right? And then I also believe that there has to be this notion that we're not going away, that we will be back. And when you come back, it's interesting. It's really amazing to see how people respond in a positive way. And we transitioned to, I think it started out as, I want to say an adversarial, but it was tensious. There's tension in the relationship at first. It went from that to maybe 5 months in, where we were the biggest supporters of this individual, right? This whole group of parents. And it just changed the dynamic in such a positive way that 2 years later, one of the biggest complaints in school is, how come they're getting all this special attention? How come you're listening to what they say? How come their children are doing well, right? And I was like, shoot, if that's not the perfect example of where we want to be, right? Where people are upset because the Black kids are doing good. Like, hey, like, I'll take that as a W for the day, because, that's
It is a win, because if Black students are doing well, honestly, all of our students are going to do well.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's usually the case, right? It's the lowest performing group.
Yeah.
They're doing well, then everyone else is going to do well statistically. We should
Right.
focus on Black students. It's
Yeah.
very good. Thank you for that. And I'll look for parents to form a group because I think the parents have been assimilated to think that they're just there to make sure that the students do the work that they're told. You know, it's like don't fight back because then your kid's going to get even more in trouble. So it takes a lot of empowerment.
It does.
Oh, well, it's about 3:31 now, but I will leave it to Dr. Wood if he can still grant us maybe a few minutes for a few questions. And please, Dr. Wood, are you still available for 5 minutes or for one more question?
I think I can take one more question, but I'd also like to note that I sent you the PowerPoint and you're more than welcome to distribute it to any of the folks who attended today.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, do we have, okay, Dr. Romano, please.
Thank you. Oh, I will give my space to student Maria Jacob instead.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Romano. I appreciate that so much. And Dr. Wood, thank you so much for such a valuable presentation. I am a future teacher. I am proudly enrolled in the bilingual multiple subject credential at Cal State San Bernardino. And I have a question. How do we bring new teachers this valuable and essential information to our team of teachers? You know, let's say that I'm a new hire. I'm still a little nervous to be speaking up about things, you know, because I want to secure my job. Yet I don't want to go without being fair and without bringing all the valuable training and information that I have, such this one, you know, to the table and to contribute perhaps with the best. How do I do that without causing the tension and without getting my job in refugee and without being in fear?
So I may not give you the answer that you're looking for, but I'm going to give you what I believe is the honest answer, at least for me. We have a responsibility to do what's uncomfortable, even if it's uncomfortable for us. And it goes back to one of the things I had said earlier, that when we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. So we have to basically provide an education that is going to truly educate and ensure that we're not putting people out into the classroom, into the education world who are going to do damage to students. In terms of resources, we have a lot of webinars that I know that me and my colleagues do on Racelighting, racial battle fatigue, and things like that. We have one that's going to be coming up. We haven't announced the date, but it'll be up soon. And it's actually different than all the other ones that we've ever done. It's a train the trainer one on Racelighting with strategies and tools and like PowerPoints and everything put together for those who want to have conversations on that in their classroom. So I'll make sure that I send an invitation, and if anybody wants to participate, what we're really trying to do is just make sure that the right conversations are happening so that people understand that you know, emotional safety in an environment is critical for students' learning, growth, and development. And when that's not there, they won't be as successful as they could be. And so hopefully that will be something that you'll engage in and that you'll be part of when we do that event. Again, it'll be in a couple months. The other thing that I would say is that there are data that is publicly available through the California Department of Education. And again, I think as was already pointed out earlier, that data is imperfect. But what I would say is it shocks me sometimes how often we'll go to a school or a school district and we'll show them their own suspension data. And then they'll say to us, well, where did you get this from? And I'll say, well, this is the data that you reported to the state, right? It's very common. In fact, I don't think there's ever been a presentation where several people in the room haven't said that, who are principals or vice principals, or even district leaders. And so I would say one of the best things you can do is show people their own data and then ask them to explain to you why that is, but not so from a standpoint of they language, where they say they aren't, they won't, they don't, but of we language. What are we doing? What are we not doing? That's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see. And what we oftentimes find is that people feel comfortable with that language because it externalizes that responsibility. But in reality, if we can get them to think from a standpoint of we, then they take ownership and they can see what role they have in perpetuating the outcome disparities that we see.
Okay.
Wow.
I want to thank Dr. Wood. This has been an amazing afternoon for all of us.
Yes.
So on behalf of the university itself, CSUSB, the teacher education, I would even say the entire Inland Empire, because looking at the names here, I know there are so many people from different schools around here that attended this presentation. We thank you enormously for giving us this opportunity to interact and chat with you. We are so grateful that you are able to make this presentation. Thank you. Please, let's clap for Dr. Wood.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.